Yes, my name is Suzanne Jensen. I was born in Burlington, Illinois, a farming community of 500 people. It's about an hour outside of Chicago, Illinois. A very conservative community. My parents are James and Dorothy. Both of them only received high school education. My father was a laborer and was a weekend farmer. We had a farm of 40 acres, and when he wasn't building construction, he was working on the farm. I'm the youngest of 6 children. We were spread out over many years. My oldest sister is 19 years older than I am, and I, being the youngest, was the very end of the group. My parents always strove to give us the best of education. We went to a small community high school. My mother came from Germany. She was a second-generation American. Her grandfather came to the United States. The story was that he came to New York Harbor and was so excited to arrive in America that he jumped off the boat and actually swam to Ellis Island. The last name of her father or grandfather was Dufer. My father is of Danish and Swiss heritage, and very proud of that. They both were raised in a small farming community. The parents actually spoke German to them most of their lives. Unfortunately, my parents didn't carry on that tradition and speak German to us as well. The farming community that I grew up in, it had very little to do. We had a village of 2 churches, a small general store, and a community school where children from farming area came from 3 different small towns to come to that school. So I knew most of the kids that I grew up with most of my life. My parents were very committed Missouri Synod Lutherans. We were all raised in the church, attending Sunday school from the time we were 3 years old, church service every Sunday. We sang in the choir, and the other family members all were participating in the church services. My background is that I actually went to school at a Lutheran teachers' college, and so we were very committed Christians. During that time, I had never really understood or even been exposed to what Islam was, but I had read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was a very small child, probably about 12 years old. And I sort of tucked that information away and came to realize it later when I decided to convert to Islam. My parents were also very conservative. We did the typical middle America family things, picnics for 4th of July, getting together for birthdays and Christmases. But because we were such a large family, it was hard to get together except during those special days. And I remember those very fondly and love them the most. In fact, when we were going through my parents' home as we were closing it up and they were moving into assisted living care, we found so many pictures of family gatherings and food around the table and lots of people laughing. It was a very happy, and I remember it fondly. Growing up in the farming community was a nice way to grow up. But I always wanted more, and I had big dreams of doing other things in my life. All of my brothers and sisters are university graduates. My parents really pushed the idea of an education is the only way to make a difference in our lives and in the world. They've always been strong supporters of giving back to the community. So I have 2 sisters that are both educators and social work type people. And my oldest sister later in life went back and received her pharmacy degree, and she worked in pharmacy for the last 20 years of her life until she retired. My brothers, all sort of business-minded. My oldest brother has worked for an American corporation at the retail level for 35 years of his life, but he did attain a master's degree in business administration. I have 2 brothers that are classically trained chefs, and both of them work at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana at this time. As I was being brought up in the church, we were always taught that the Trinity was the one way to believe, and that meant that God was in fact 3, that He was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I always questioned that. I couldn't understand why Jesus, being a man, would also be God. And I would question that to my parents, and they just said, this is our belief, sort of believing without thinking about it. And that always concerned me. The other issue that I had was that as we were going to church, we were supposed to confess our sins and to a minister or to a man. And I was always uncomfortable with that because I believed that spirituality and religion is a personal thing, that the relationship between a believer and their God, there should be nobody that comes between. As I grew up in the church, I tried to question it, but I was always told that it was a lack in faith, that something was weak in my faith, and that would be a problem that would lead to the hellfire. So it was a way for them to put down that questioning process. I was so committed that I ended up attending Concordia University outside of Chicago. It is a Lutheran university designed to educate and train ministers and Lutheran school teachers. So I started my first semester there, and it was unique because on campus there was also a school for teaching students of international students of foreign language. They were there to learn English. We interacted with them on campus quite often. And in fact, on campus, every day at 10 o'clock, all classes would stop and we would attend chapel. So the chapel bells would ring, we would go into the church and have our service, and then in about half an hour we'd go back to classes. The international students that I met quite often asked about what are we doing in that building and why do we go? And it was a natural way for us to discuss religion. In the program for the English language students, I met students from China and Japan and all across the Middle East. I got very close to two young ladies, one from Qatar and one from Syria, who we had quite heated discussions at times about religion and the differences of religion. And they would tell me, how can you believe that God is three? And we opened this discussion many times, and they thought I was silly and foolish and misguided. And I didn't really understand their point of view. When I finally took a world religion class, my professor assigned us, each one, to study one religion and prepare a research project. It was a natural transition for me to study Islam. So I asked the girls, please, I need to get some books because our library had no books about Islam. There was a copy of the Quran translated into English, but only the English translation. And I read, and it interested me, but it wasn't a big enough picture. So I begged the girls, please help me find the books that I need. They sort of laughed because they were not really practicing, but they said they had an idea about how I could get the information. One of the girls gave me a scarf and said, you can go with my brother to the mosque when he goes for Friday prayer. So I waited for the bus with my scarf in my hand, and I went to the Friday prayer in Bridgeville, Illinois. When I got there, I was amazed at the amount of people that were there to make their salah. And when I first heard the adhan, I got goosebumps, and I was amazed at both the voice of the muadhin and the way the people reacted. I stood and watched the prayer with the scarf on my head. A lot of ladies told me just bow and do what they do. I stood at the back and watched, amazed at how the people prostrated and really submitted to Allah. Afterwards, I went to the masjid's library and borrowed the books that I needed, and they were very gracious, telling me to even keep copies of things that I needed if I wanted to. I very eagerly took my books home and started studying, and I read Islam in Focus, I read the Quran from cover to cover, and I also read a very influential book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science by French Muslim Maurice Bucaille. It was amazing to me. It really laid out the reasons why a person should be Muslim in a very logical way. He cited many verses from the Quran and their proof in the modern world. And after reading that, I knew that I had to submit to Allah, that I needed to be Muslim. I talked to the girls about it, and they were really surprised. And I started changing. I started changing the way that I dressed. I was already more conservative, but all of a sudden I became really conservative. And I started questioning more. In one of my classes where we were studying the Bible, I asked the professor, in the Bible translation that we have, it says that women should cover when they worship. And that's the translation from the Greek and the Latin versions of the Bible. When I asked him how come we don't do that anymore, he said people evolve and they don't need to do this. But it was proof. It was there in the original translations of the Bible, but it had been removed by who? By man. So when I questioned him at this level, he got concerned. And this professor pulled me into his office after class and said, "This is a very concerning issue for me. You're questioning your own faith, and that weakness in faith will certainly send you to hell. You need to get that corrected." And he asked me to pray about it and to spend more time in worship. And I did, but not in the church. I returned to the mosque with my books in hand and asked if there was any way that I could study Islam. And I was quickly connected with a wonderful Muslimah from Canada. She was a practicing dentist at the time, and she had converted to Islam as well. I spent some time talking to her on a personal level about Islam, and then she sent me to an English study group. It was conducted by a wonderful woman from the Sudan. Her husband is a very notable sheikh and was living here in America. I understand they've moved back to the Sudan right now. But she was certainly my guide and my mentor. And we studied in English and read Quran, and she explained the verses to us. We learned the fiqh, the rules of the practice of Islam. And I knew that I had to be Muslim. During this time also, I had met a young man who was studying in the English language program, and he presented me with this option. He said, "Marry me, or I can't see you again, because this is what my religion teaches me, that I can only have a relationship with a young woman in marriage." I thought about it, and I was a little bit offended that this is the way he presented it to me, but I knew it was right. So we married with the idea that I would convert to Islam, but he prevented me for a while. He said, "Take it slow, take it easy, make sure that it's the right thing for you." But my mind was already made up. I knew that's exactly what I wanted.